I'm Lloyd Holiday, and this is the Cost of a Thing podcast. Thanks for listening in today. The cost of a thing is the amount of time that you must spend working to buy the things that you want and need. And that directly determines your standard of living. And the American standard of living is what this podcast is all about. And I'm going to be discussing anything that affects that standard of living, especially those things that affect it negatively. And especially those things that have lowered our standard of living from the one that we had in America here in the 1960s, which was better than the one today. And why am I doing this? Because I don't see the government addressing these issues. I don't see the media addressing these issues. They've either forgotten them or ignored them. And these are some of the most important things that determine, of course, how we're going to live, how well we're going to live in the world today, especially for the young people. Okay, I'm going to call this podcast a Mooncast, because this is going to be a podcast to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the landing of the first man on the moon. That was July 20th, 1969, and that's the date that I'm going to hope to get this podcast out there, right on that same date, 50 years later. So I hope you all enjoy this Mooncast. So 50 years ago today, the first humans set foot on the moon. And that was Apollo 11, and they landed the lunar lander on the moon, and Neil Armstrong got out and walked on the moon. I think some of the other guys, or at least one of the other ones did, also one of the other guys there. And I'm going to just call it as it is. It's probably man's greatest achievement ever in the history of the world up to that point, and even up to this point, I think. I don't think anything greater has been done, and it was certainly something to experience firsthand as a kid aged 13 at the time. I just turned 13 around that time, and not long before the man landed on the moon there. And I remember it as if it was yesterday, and I know there was some kind of grainy black and white films on TV, live. I think it was live, and we were all watching it, Mom and Dad, and everybody in the neighborhood. Everybody was excited about it. It was really a national coming together, and everybody was there to watch this, and it was amazing. It gives me goosebumps just thinking about it even now. It was really something to be there at the time when that actually happened. And I certainly am glad that I was alive to see that, and then to be able to look back 50 years now later at it, and just really look at it in awe, and even more awe now, because no other country has even landed a man on the moon, even now, 50 years later. So that shows what a huge achievement it really was. And I know the moon landing came about because of President Kennedy and his great speech at Rice University. I think it was in 1962, saying that we were going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade of the 1960s. And after he was assassinated, then that was like I think the country wanted to make his dream of that happening come true, and they did. They made it happen before the end of the decade of the 60s. And of course, for me, living in the 1960s, it was a great decade to grow up in. and we had the greatest standard of living probably ever in the history of humankind here in the United States at that time, the 1960s. As I always say, if you've watched any of my podcasts, and it's true, believe me, it was a better standard of living in the 1960s, way better than it is today. And you not only had that standard of living, but you had all that great music coming. Anybody that doesn't know about the great music that came in the 1960s, go back and listen to it. It's all over YouTube. It's all great. Every week I had about 10 or 20 great songs throughout the 60s, and that was kind of like a musical score to my whole childhood and everybody else that was there at the time. And the music still stands and is great today also. So like I say, the moon landing was like a crown jewel, a crowning of one of the greatest decades in the history of the world, and that was the 1960s. That moon landing, I think it was the crowning jewel of that decade and of all history, in my opinion. And if you guys are interested, and go out and listen to Kennedy's speech when he predicted the moon landing would be before the end of the decade of the 60s. I think it was 1961 or 1962 at Rice University. That speech is out there on the internet, on YouTube right now. And I would recommend anybody, especially if you weren't here at the time, go listen to that speech. It's a very powerful speech. It may be really the best speech that I've ever heard anybody give, whether they're a politician or anybody. It really was a great speech. And the reason I like it so much is because it is a speech about the best of what humanity is. It talks about the best things that humanity does. And in it, Kennedy, he speaks of how to get the best out of ourselves and how to do the best we can do while we're here on this earth. And it really is inspirational. I listen to it even today for inspiration. And I think I'll do a little Kennedy imitation, the best part of the speech that I like. And let me get tuned up a little, my Kennedy voice, kind of get into character here. I can do a kind of a not very good Kennedy imitation, but let me try a little of it. I'll do one of his other speeches first. Ask not what you can do for your... No, it's not that. It's ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Now, that's one of his other speeches. That's about as good as I can do on Kennedy. But now I'm going to do the speech that he gave at Rice University, a couple of lines from that, about the moon landing and the moon project. Okay, here's Kennedy, my imitation of Kennedy, doing a couple of lines from the moon speech at Rice University, 1961 or 62. I don't know which year that is exactly. Some say, why go to the moon? Why choose to go to the moon? We choose to go to the moon not because it's easy. We choose to go to the moon because it's hard. And we choose to go to the moon because it will measure the best of our energies and... Okay, that was kind of paraphrasing, but you know what? I got the exact speech here, and I'm gonna do it again. The exact paragraph from the speech that I like the best, the best part of the best speech I ever heard. Okay, here's Kennedy again. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and to do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one that we are unwilling to postpone, and one that we intend to win, and the others too. I'm gonna do another one here. So that was my best. John F. Kennedy doing his famous Rice University moon speech from 1961, and it could have been from 62, but I really encourage everybody to go out there and listen to that speech. It's very inspirational, not just about going to the moon, but about anything that a human being wants to do on this earth, and how that ties into standard of living. It does, because when you get the best out of yourself, you're going to have a better standard of living every time. I guarantee that. And Kennedy you can see by that speech, he was the president at the time in 1961 or 2, and he was pushing this landing on the moon to get the best of our energies, as he said. And he was the force that got us to the moon first. United States first on the moon, and still, as I said, 50 years later, no other country, nobody else has done it. So what a massive achievement it was, and he was the driving force behind it. Never would have happened that soon without him, that's for sure. And I think it did bring out the best of our energies in the 60s. A lot of scientific breakthroughs and special inventions were created and developed during that time specifically for the moon landing and the space program. And a lot of those things led to the technologies we have today that we all have enjoyed, many of them since the 60s, and some of them have branched off from those, and now we have a lot more great technology, all because of the moon program that brought out the best of our energies. And of course, I'd like to pay tribute to all the men and women who put that together at NASA, and all the subcontractors and defense contractors and avionics and contractors that all put that together. And just a super achievement. And of course, it was the World War II generation, the super achievers that they were, that put that whole thing together and pulled it off. Kennedy himself was from that generation, and he's the one that took the lead on the whole thing. And they really didn't borrow money to pay for it as we do today. These guys, they paid for it as they went. You know, it cost billions of dollars to do that back in those days. And they paid for the whole thing as they went. They didn't borrow up money, as the group nowadays seems to be doing for everything we do now, which I think makes it all the more impressive. You know, as a kid at the time when I saw that they were landing on the moon, I mean, I figured in 10 or 15 years after that, we'd all be going to the moon, you know, taking rides up to the moon and walking around and all that. Well, never happened. Even the government never went back once. Well, they went a few times in the early 70s, and then after that, they just never went again. Nobody's been up there in at least 45 years. So I'm not sure why, but they just kind of cut the thing off and didn't go up there. Well, I was hoping, you know, we'd all be going up to the moon and on vacation. Never happened. So the 50-year anniversary of the moon landing, that's a big one. And wow, that's all I can say even today is wow. And 50 years ago, imagine they didn't have the technology they have today, but they still put it together and made it happen. And that is really impressive. And like I said, I think it's the greatest achievement, greatest single achievement man has ever accomplished. And you know, man only learned how to fly an airplane in the early part of the 20th century. And here, about 50 years later, they were flying clear to the moon and landing and then flying back. So, what a 50 years that was. It was an amazing progress that was made during that 50 years from the early 1900s until 1969 when they landed on the moon that day. Amazing. Thank you for listening in today. And until next time, this is Lloyd Holiday signing off.